Alright, so here we have a task 2. Some people think that a new language should be invented for people from different countries to use for the international communication. I'm not sure why it's the international communication, but okay. To what extent do you think its advantages far outweigh its disadvantages? I'm also not sure why there's a far in this question. But okay, we have our introduction. We have body paragraph 1, body paragraph 2, and we have our summary, which comes to 381 words, which is a lot. So if you are online and you see example essays that have like 300 or 400 words, just keep in mind the people who wrote this didn't sit down and do this in 40 minutes. They spent hours on this. No, some of them might spend days. So these lengthy essays are not necessarily always a very good example of what to do. Just keep that in mind. Okay, here is the introduction. In the contemporary world, the pace of globalization is advancing at a meteoric speed. Accordingly, some people propose that a lingua franca should be contrived for individuals all over the world to conduct international communication. However, people hold divergent views when it comes to this issue. Personally, I tend to believe that it's meaningless to simply compare the merits and drawbacks of inventing a universal language, as both sides are not ignorable. Alright, so let's see what I would do with this. Well, first of all, let's have a look at what I made blue here. This has to do with the cohesion, how everything in the paragraph ties together. So we have this in the contemporary world. So this prepositional phrase, and then we have the pace of globalization is advancing at a meteoric speed. Okay, so we know the topic is going to be globalization and how fast it's advancing. And then here we have the adverb accordingly, and here we have another adverb personally. So these sentences are both started with adverbs, and the accordingly refers nicely back to this here. Now I wouldn't really change much here, except this. The merits and drawbacks of inventing a universal language, as both sides are not ignorable. There's no word like ignorable. Something can be ignored. You can ignore things, but there's no adjective or participle ignorable. Now, I'm not entirely sure what the writer is trying to say. I mean, this phrase, that something has its own merits, this is a very standard phrase that you see a lot of people use in task 2. Maybe they mean this, or maybe they mean it's not easy to dismiss either side. If they meant that you can't easily dismiss them, you could just have said dismissed, but we have this idiom, cannot be easily brushed away. This has the same meaning as to dismiss something. If something cannot be easily brushed away, it cannot be easily dismissed. So I'm not sure exactly what the writer means, but they would definitely need to change the word ignorable, because there's no word like that. Now, the lingua franca, that is a very good word to use, and one that you should add to your vocabulary. Oh, I forgot to mention contrived. Maybe I should make that red also. I'm not entirely sure what the writer's attitude is here. But if something is contrived, it means that it's done unnaturally. And it has a negative meaning. So if that is what the writer means, then fine, use the word contrived. But if you describe something as contrived, it means you have an unfavorable opinion of that. And he says, or she says here, they both have their merits. So it sounds like the writer is neutral. So I'm not sure if contrived then is the right word. But I'm not sure what their actual intention is. Let's move on. Alright, here's the first body paragraph. Compelling arguments can be made that different languages undoubtedly cause obstacles and misunderstandings in conversation, restricting the native to communicate with foreigners. In contrast, a universal language may not only bring about convenience for individuals in their daily life, learning and working, but promote joint development the world over, smooth the talk between nations, and drive societal advance as well. For example, college students are expected to no longer rely on mechanical translation software when downloading foreign essays and material, and companies can economize their costs and budget because it is unnecessary for them to hire simultaneous interpreters. Meanwhile, foreign countries are accessible to travelers due to the fact that individuals no longer fret about cultural shock and linguistic obstacles. Consequently, contriving a fresh language is sure to produce profits for both the public and countries from all over the world. Alright, let's have a look at this one. Okay, so again, I highlighted some phrases using blue just to show how everything ties nicely together with the use of these words. Alright, so we have our topic here about compelling arguments. So we know what we're going to be reading about. The example is introduced by the phrase "for example," and then we have "meanwhile" and "consequently" here to give, well, I guess the "meanwhile" is an addition, the second example, and well, consequently, well, that's self-explanatory. Some things I would change. This here, restricting the native to communicate with foreigners. Alright, a few things. If you restrict someone to something, it means they can only do that. So if you say that the natives are restricted to communicating with foreigners, that means that they are only able to communicate with foreigners. So that's probably not what you want to say. So what they might want to say here is restricting the natives' communication with foreigners. So there's no to. Restricting the natives' communication with foreigners. Now, another issue, what? Native speaker? I don't know what the native is. And I can tell that this is a Chinese speaker who wrote this, because Chinese speakers love to use the word foreigners. There's nothing wrong with that, but I don't see a lot of native speakers using the word foreigner. Okay, maybe it's a cultural issue. I forgot to include the in contrast in what I said before about the phrases used to give cohesions to the writing. But let's move on. So individuals, plural, so in their daily life, so let's change this to lives. But then learning and working, is this really necessary? This is why the writing is 381 words long, because daily life is essentially this. So do we really need that? No, we don't. But promote joint development all over the world. Maybe they mean cooperation. I'm not entirely sure what this is referring to, because they talk about language and how misunderstandings are going to be avoided. So maybe cooperation. And nations conduct talks. It's not the talks. And if you want to say that the talks, if you're going to say that the talks are going to be done more smoothly, then the verb is smooth over, not just smooth. So smooth over talks. We don't need the here because you're not talking about any specific talks, so we don't need that article there. Societal advance. Let's change that advance to advancement. For example, college students are expected to no longer rely on mechanical software. I don't understand why. Because why is it are expected? Surely this is going to be in the future once we have this global language. So college students won't be expected. but we can't use the present tense because this language doesn't exist now. It's a proposal for the future. Now, mechanical translation software, I don't know how software by its nature can be mechanical, because mechanical means it's machine related, and software is code. There's no mechanical software. Software is code. Machines are machines. Downloading foreign essays and material. Companies can economize their costs. I'm not sure that costs can be economized. They can reduce their costs. If we use the verb reduce, that can go with costs and budget. You definitely cannot economize your budget. Those two don't go together. Now, if we say cut costs, cut goes with costs, cut also goes with budget, reduce also goes with costs, and reduce also goes with budget. So maybe consider one of those verbs. And then simultaneous interpreters. There's no such thing as a simultaneous interpreter. You are an interpreter and that's it. Now, there is such a thing as simultaneous interpreting. That's where you interpret from one language into another language, and then again you interpret from the other language into the original language. But the person is called an interpreter. Now, what they do could be simultaneous interpreting, but there's no such thing as a simultaneous interpreter. Now, the cultural shock, the reason why I put this in green is, even though people speak the same language, they can still have different cultures. So I don't think just because you can understand what people say, there's no cultural shock. No longer fret. Fret's a great word to use. Not entirely sure it's suitable for test 2, but it's still a great word to use. But I'm not convinced about the cultural shock, because different countries can speak the same language but still have vastly different cultures. I mean, take North and South Korea, for example. Contriving, again, I have the same problem, because he's using this word to describe something that, he or she clearly regards as positive, but this is a negative word. Produce profits for both the public and countries from all over the world. Profit here means money, but there's no mention of money here. So maybe benefit instead of money. Public and countries, how are these different? The people from around the world is the public, and the people from around the world means the countries around the world. Unless you're referring to the government, when you say countries, that means the people. So I don't really think there's a difference between public and countries. Same thing. All of these little additional extra words, all of these not repetitive, that's not the word I want to say. There's a lot of redundancy. Like they use 2 or 3 words when one will do. All of this adds up to the word count. So be careful with redundancy. Although if you just have 40 minutes, I guess it's not such a big problem. But if you are writing an essay that you want to put on the internet, it's easy to get carried away. Alright, let's move on. However, admittedly, notwithstanding the reality that a lingua franca has a variety of advantages, we should still be consciously aware of its downsides. For one thing, on the basis of recent research and statistics, the vernacular and lesser-known languages are disappearing at a staggering rate. And it seems that under the huge impact of dominant languages like the proliferation of English, the extinction of lesser-known languages are just around the corner. For the other thing, some experts and scholars are anxious about the phenomenon that cultural assimilation may give rise to global uniformity, rendering life becoming become dull and monotonous. Traditions, rites, rituals, mores, and the language of a culture are all unifying forces of a nation, and the decline of them erodes the national identity and national pride of a country. Okay, let's have a look at this one. Alright, so here's my take on this paragraph. However, admittedly, I mean, is there a difference in meaning? Why do we need both words? Choose one. However, notwithstanding. Admittedly, notwithstanding. Don't put both together. Oh, hang on a second. I forgot one thing. The topic here is downsides, obviously. And then introducing the first downside, we have this phrase for one thing. I don't know, it's a little colloquial for academic writing. I wouldn't use this for academic writing, but still. And then here we have and then we have this attempt here, and then we have an example here, which is not preceded by any introductory phrase. They just go straight into an example, which is also fine. Let's see. We should be consciously aware of its downsides. I don't know how you can be unconsciously aware of something. If you are conscious of something, it means you are aware. Again, redundant words, just like here. We don't need both. Choose one. We should be aware, we should be conscious. Choose one. So for one thing, yeah, it's used to introduce the first example. I think it's a little bit too informal here, but okay. Now, vernacular and lesser known languages, I think maybe they want to say the vernacular of lesser known languages. A language has vernacular, so the vernacular of the language. Let's see here. Here we have extinction. So why is there an R here? This is a singular extinction. Then originally here the sentence was for the other thing. Now you could say another thing, but this phrase doesn't work. You can't say for the other thing. This is not correct. And even if you say another thing, that is way too informal for task 2 writing. So why not go with additionally? It's a much better word if you want to give a second reason. Rendering life. Okay, so here we have adjective, adjective. So if we have the verb rendering, then we don't need a verb here. So rendering, noun, adjective. Dull and monotonous. I'm not sure that there's a difference between the two. Again, maybe just choose one. That's why the word total is so high. Let's see here. The decline of them. Okay, this is just a grammar issue, so it should be their decline, not the decline of them. Alright, let's look at the conclusion. Okay, here we have it. Overall, based on what's been discussed above, I feel whether to contrive a new language is a sophisticated issue which we're well advised to take varying aspects into account before we make the final decision. Okay, just a few things. Okay, the overall, it's a good way to announce that this is going to be the summary. Sophisticated has a positive meaning. I'm not sure that's exactly what the writer wants to say. Maybe complex is a better way of saying that. And here we have a relative pronouns. Let's put a comma there. Before we make, why don't we just say before making the final decision? But now, speaking of that, what decision are they actually talking about? Let's go back to the task. The task says, to what extent do you think it advantages... Okay, let's get rid of this for. That's a mistake that the author of this made. To what extent do you think its advantages outweigh its disadvantages? So they're not asking you what decisions should we make. They're asking you, well, what it says here. So to then say, well, we should think about it before we make a decision. Yeah, it's not entirely off topic, but that's not exactly what the task is asking you to do. The task doesn't ask you to make a decision. It asks you to discuss its advantages and disadvantages. It's a minor point, I admit it, but I think it is valid. If this writing was a little bit shorter, maybe 260, 270 words, I think it would have been a better example. As it stands right now, it is a good example. It's just a little bit lengthy. So if you look at some of the vocabulary that was used and you look at the structure that was used here, I think you might learn something. Okay, so I hope you found this video helpful. Thank you for watching.